She was 72 years old, barely 5 feet tall, walking back from the corner store with a bag of oranges and a cane in her trembling hand when the officer pulled over, yelled something about loitering and without warning, slapped her so hard she dropped to the ground screaming, the fruit rolling into the street as bystanders froze. But when he looked up and saw who was standing behind him, his face went white as chalk and he whispered, "Oh God, not him." What happened next changed everything. This story is real, raw, and deeply unsettling. So stay with us till the end. Don't forget to hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more shocking true stories that deserve to be heard. Now let's get into it. The moment her frail body hit the pavement, a hush swept over the neighborhood block like the wind had been sucked out of the street itself. Mrs. Eloise Daniels lay on the curb with blood trickling from her lip. One lens of her glasses cracked from the force of the officer's slap, and the world seemed to slow as everyone standing nearby processed what they had just witnessed. Officer Ryan Kelman, tall, white, buzz-cut, early 30s, a known presence in the community for all the wrong reasons, stood over her with his hands still mid-air, not fully realizing what he'd done until the silence became screams. "You hit her! She's a grandma!" Someone yelled from across the street, but Ryan didn't turn to look, because his eyes were locked on the reflection in the glass of the barbershop window behind Eloise. Someone was standing there. Someone he didn't expect to see. Someone he thought was thousands of miles away. But no, it was his former commanding officer, Major Terrence Marshall, now retired, now older, but unmistakably there, and not just any man. Major Marshall was not only the highest-ranking black officer Ryan had ever served under, but the man who had personally vouched for him when a complaint was filed 4 years ago about another excessive force incident that conveniently disappeared from the records after Ryan promised it would never happen again. The look on Major Marshall's face wasn't shock. It was pure disappointment, and that cut deeper than any disciplinary report ever could, because Ryan knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the entire department, the city, the lies they had built. Their reputation on the camera phones were already up, people recording from every angle, and Eloise, still trying to sit up, whispered the name of her grandson under her breath. "Call Jalen." And someone immediately pulled out their phone to do just that, because everyone in the neighborhood knew who Jalen Daniels was, civil rights attorney, loud, bold, unafraid to go toe-to-toe with the establishment, and most importantly, the only person who could make sure what just happened didn't get swept under the rug like so many other incidents before. As sirens screamed in the distance, backup already en route due to Officer Ryan's call, code for non-compliant civilian, a term he threw around way too often. Major Marshall stepped off the curb and walked slowly toward the scene, the tension so thick it could be sliced with a knife, his steps calm, deliberate, like a man who had seen war zones and corruption, and was no longer interested in playing nice. He knelt beside Eloise without saying a word to Ryan, gently helping her sit up while murmuring, "I'm here, ma'am, I've got you, we're gonna make this right." And in that moment, the crowd saw the contrast they didn't know they needed. One officer in uniform standing in violence, and one veteran in plain clothes standing in integrity. And it was clear who the real authority was. Ryan tried to speak, his voice cracking. She wasn't listening. "She kept loitering," I told her. But Major Marshall cut him off without raising his voice. "You slapped an unarmed elderly woman in broad daylight." Ryan, with witnesses, with video, with her name echoing across the city, because her grandson just made national headlines last week, defending a teenage boy beaten by cops in Atlanta. The silence fell again, because now the weight of what had just happened began to settle in Ryan's chest like concrete. He hadn't recognized Eloise at first. Didn't know who she was, only saw an old black woman moving too slow, and decided that was enough to provoke authority. But now it was too late. The moment was captured. The internet was already boiling. And this wouldn't go away, not this time, as more officers pulled up and tried to assert control. Marshall raised one hand and said, "I suggest no one touches her without a medic, and no one touches the footage on these phones unless they want to see their names trending for all the wrong reasons." People nodded, the crowd growing larger now, neighbors pouring out from porches, kids stopping their bikes to see what was happening, and across the street, inside the nail salon, 2 women were already live-streaming, saying things like, "This is what we go through, even our grandmothers ain't safe," and "Look how she's bleeding, for what, oranges?" And just like that, the story took on a life of its own, spreading from block to block, screen to screen, city to city, because injustice caught on camera travels faster than the truth the police try to spin. Paramedics arrived minutes later, tending to Eloise with care and whispering apologies they weren't responsible for. And when they asked her if she felt okay going to the hospital, she said only, "My grandson is coming. I'll go when he gets here." Ryan stood frozen by his patrol car, his radio still crackling, his career unraveling in real time, and every step Jalen Daniels took as he walked down the street toward the flashing lights and the crowd was like a drumbeat of justice. He wore no tie, just a black hoodie and jeans, but everyone moved aside like royalty was arriving, because Jalen didn't come to talk, he came to handle. The first thing he did was kneel next to his grandmother and kiss her forehead. "You're okay. Nana, I got you," he said, her eyes wet with pain and relief. Then he stood and turned to face Officer Ryan, who now looked 10 years older than he did an hour ago. "I hope you know your days of hiding behind the badge are over," Jalen said coldly. "Because this time, you messed with the wrong family." Ryan tried to defend himself again, but his voice was drowned out by the chants starting to rise from the crowd. "Justice for Eloise! Justice for Eloise!" And in the chaos, a news van pulled up, a reporter jumped out, asking for interviews. The footage already circulating online had sparked attention faster than anyone could predict, and now the department would have to answer questions they'd spent years dodging. Jalen raised his phone and hit record himself, live streaming his statement right there on the street. "My grandmother was assaulted by a sworn officer of the law unprovoked. Unjustified, unacceptable, and we will not rest until this man is held accountable in court, in public, and under the very laws he swore to uphold." The video gained 20,000 views in less than 10 minutes, and within the hour it was picked up by national outlets. Officer Ryan Kellman's name was trending beside terms like racist cop, elder abuse, and police brutality caught on tape. The department issued a weak preliminary statement promising an internal review. But no one was buying it, not this time, because Jalen Daniels wasn't backing down. And neither was the community. Protests began forming that evening. Peaceful, organized, loud, with signs that read "Hands off our elders" and "Black grandmothers matter," and "If you touch one, you answer to all." The mayor was forced to speak. The chief of police tried to backpedal, and somewhere in his apartment, Ryan stared at his phone screen, replaying the moment he raised his hand and struck a woman who could have been his own grandmother, wondering how it had all come to this. But for Eloise, healing wouldn't just be physical, it would be generational, because her story awakened something in people, a reminder that the struggle wasn't over, that dignity must be defended, and that accountability doesn't come from silence, it comes from truth, exposure, and the courage of those who refuse to be quiet when injustice stands tall in uniform. Jalen Daniels didn't sleep that night, not because he was tired but because his mind raced with every angle, every law, every case precedent he could summon to make sure what happened to his grandmother would lead to real accountability, not just press conferences and PR damage control, but actual consequences. He was used to fighting these battles for strangers, for families who came to him with bloodshot eyes and shaking voices. But this time it was personal, this time it was his own flesh. And blood sprawled on the pavement because a man in a badge forgot what restraint meant, forgot what humanity meant, forgot that the world was watching even when he thought it wasn't, except this time the world was watching from every angle, every phone, every live stream and news channel. And by morning, the footage had already sparked citywide protests, students walking out of school holding posters with Eloise's face, church groups praying in the streets, and business owners closing shop in solidarity. The mayor called an emergency press briefing, sweat visible beneath his collar as he stammered through his speech about community trust and pending investigation. But the people weren't interested in promises anymore. They wanted arrests, they wanted indictments, and most of all, they wanted Officer Ryan Kellman to be removed, not reassigned, not suspended, not protected by unions or excuses. Removed, charged, and held accountable like any other man would be if he assaulted a senior citizen in broad daylight. Meanwhile, Eloise remained in the hospital, surrounded by flowers, phone calls, and warm hands that wouldn't stop holding hers. She kept saying she didn't want to be a martyr, didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to walk to the store without being seen as a threat, without being shouted at, without her skin being mistaken for resistance. But deep down, she knew what her face now meant to the city. It meant visibility, it meant voice, it meant all the others who had never gotten their story told. Jalen sat beside her every hour he could, drafting legal arguments on his laptop while holding her hand. And on the third day he filed a civil lawsuit against Officer Kelman and the department for use of excessive force, violation of civil rights, elder abuse and racial profiling, and when he walked out of the courthouse with the paperwork in his hand, reporters swarmed him, microphones extended like swords, and all he said was, "This is day one," and turned to walk away. Inside police headquarters, things weren't calm. In fact, they were unraveling. Leaks were coming out. Officers who had once protected Ryan were distancing themselves. One even anonymously submitted body cam footage from a separate incident where Ryan shoved a teen during a stop and frisk. Another revealed that Ryan had been disciplined quietly 2 years ago after a similar slap to a homeless man outside a liquor store. All of it hidden, all of it buried, until now. And suddenly it wasn't just about Eloise anymore, it was about a pattern, a culture, a long-held silence that now roared like thunder across the city. Internal Affairs launched a formal probe, and Chief Marlowe, the man who once praised Ryan as a rising star, stood behind a podium barely able to control the political firestorm. "We are conducting a full investigation, and will take appropriate action once all facts are reviewed," he said, but the crowd outside the press room booed so loud his voice was drowned out. People weren't waiting anymore, not for facts, not for reports, because the facts were already playing on their phones and TVs on loop. The slap, the blood, the stunned crowd, the pale-faced cop, the honorable veteran stepping in, the grandson standing tall, and the chants that rose like sirens from the streets. Ryan Kelman, now suspended, sat alone in his apartment staring at the front door, waiting for a knock he knew would come eventually. His badge sat in a drawer, his phone off the hook, his world shrinking by the minute, and still he couldn't quite grasp what went wrong, because in his mind he still saw himself as the authority, the law, the man with the right to decide who belonged where. But the city no longer saw him that way, and neither did the law firms now lining up to assist Jalen in the civil case. This wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about dismantling a culture of unchecked power. Jalen was meticulous, building the case not just with legal precision, but with storytelling mastery. He gathered every angle of footage, every medical report, every witness statement, and with the help of digital experts, reconstructed a minute-by-minute replay of the entire incident, down to the moment Eloise picked up the oranges from the store. It was undeniable, it was brutal, and when presented in court, it painted a picture so vivid not even the department's lawyers could spin it. Meanwhile, national organizations took notice, civil rights coalitions offered support, and celebrities began tweeting with hashtags like #JusticeForEloise and #ProtectOurSeniors, bringing even more light to the case. The courtroom overflowed when the first hearing began. Eloise was wheeled in with quiet dignity, wearing a pale lavender dress and a scarf over her shoulder. The judge asked if she was comfortable testifying, and she nodded, her voice soft but firm as she recounted every second. "He looked at me like I was less than human, like I didn't deserve to walk down my own street," she said, and you could hear a pin drop in the room. Ryan sat at the defense table, visibly thinner, face blank, eyes darting, his lawyer trying to object but being overruled again and again, because the evidence was overwhelming, and the public pressure was undeniable. Protests continued outside, peaceful and unified, and every day more people joined. Not just black families but white, Latino, Asian, young, old. United not by politics, but by the simple idea that what happened was wrong, and had to be made right. By week 2 of the trial, Ryan's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Jalen refused unless accountability included a public admission, a formal apology, and a sentence that matched the gravity of the crime. The judge agreed with the motion to move to trial and rejected early settlement, declaring the case a matter of public interest. And when Eloise was asked what justice would look like for her, she said, "I want to see him walk into a cell just like they make our boys do. I want him to know what it feels like to lose freedom for a second, because mine was taken in one slap." Her words were repeated across headlines, screens, and news panels, sparking more protests and greater calls for change. Ryan's record was now public, and more victims began to speak, including a young man named Devin, who testified that Ryan had once pressed his head against a police car for questioning why he was being stopped, and a mother named Liana who tearfully described how Ryan once accused her of theft in front of her kids for picking up a free food box from a church sidewalk. The pattern became clear. This wasn't one incident. This was years of unchecked behavior. and now the city had to decide if it would remain complicit or finally draw a line. The courtroom became a battleground not of race alone but of decency, power and truth, and through it all, Eloise sat with grace. Her presence reminding everyone why they were there, not for politics, not for headlines, but because no elder should be hurt and discarded by the system meant to protect them. By the end of the fourth week, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts, and gasps echoed through the courtroom, followed by tears, hugs, and the silent exhale of a city that had waited too long for justice that often never comes. Ryan was sentenced to 2 years behind bars and 5 years probation. Stripped of his badge and forbidden from holding any future law enforcement position. The courtroom applauded, not for vengeance, but for accountability, for proof that the system could work when people refused to be silent. Outside, the city erupted with celebration. But Jalen wasn't done, not yet. He launched a campaign to introduce Eloise's Law, a bill requiring immediate review of all use-of-force incidents involving senior citizens and mandatory release of footage within 48 hours. And within months, the law passed. The governor signed it with Eloise sitting proudly by his side, her photo now framed in City Hall, not as a victim but as a voice, as a legacy, and as a reminder that even the smallest, softest voices can echo loud enough to break down walls when the right people listen. The day Eloise's Law passed, the city felt different, not perfect, not fixed, but changed. Her name was no longer just a headline or a trending hashtag, it was now etched in legal code. Her pain turned into policy, her dignity reclaimed not just by the justice system, but by every voice that marched, called, recorded, shared, and stood up when it mattered most. And though she never asked to be a symbol, Eloise Daniels became a beacon, the kind that shines not because it seeks attention but because it survives fire and still stands tall. People from other states began reaching out, other grandmothers, other sons, people who had buried stories too painful to tell but now found courage in hers. Meanwhile, Jalen's career skyrocketed, but not because of fame, because of purpose, because he chose truth over comfort, justice over convenience, and community over applause. He declined national interviews, turned down book deals, even rejected an offer to run for office. Instead, he opened a legal center in the neighborhood where his grandmother had been assaulted, offering free representation to victims of police misconduct and unjust arrests. The center was called the Eloise Initiative, and within 6 months it had taken on over 40 local cases, 5 of which led to charges being dropped or officers being disciplined. But none of this was easy. The backlash came hard and fast, anonymous threats, slander campaigns, even a vandalism incident at the community center. But Jalen stood firm, flanked by volunteers, organizers, teachers, pastors, barbers, mothers, and children who had seen what happens when you don't back down. His team grew, not just lawyers but youth counselors, trauma specialists, and documentarians who wanted to preserve the story in full, not just the slap but the silence that followed, the scream that broke it, and the movement that rose from it. Ryan Kelman, meanwhile, sat behind bars, no longer the man with the badge, now just another inmate with a number. His world had shrunk to a bunk and a schedule, his face familiar to guards and inmates alike, some of whom had watched the footage and didn't forget. He kept his head down, said little, wrote long letters to no one in particular, trying to make sense of a fall from grace he still hadn't fully accepted, and somewhere in the letters he began to write about his childhood, about the small-town sheriff who taught him that force equals respect, about his first job as a security guard where he learned to see every black man as a suspect. And while the letters would never justify his actions, they exposed a system that raised boys to fear color, to equate control with violence, and to never question the hand that feeds you. Those letters were leaked eventually, read aloud in classrooms and workshops, not to forgive but to understand how hatred is taught, how silence is nurtured, and how violence wears a badge long before the uniform is even put on. Eloise heard about the letters, but didn't want to read them, not because she hated him, she didn't, but because her energy was focused on healing, not hate. She had become the heart of her neighborhood again, leading prayer circles, organizing walks for seniors, sharing stories with school kids about dignity and peace, and every month, she sat in the front row of the legal center's town halls, nodding as young people took the mic and spoke their truths. One of them, a 17-year-old girl named Amaya, shared how she once dreamed of becoming a cop but gave up after watching what happened to Eloise. Her voice shook as she said, "But seeing her fight made me want to try again, not to be like them but to change what they are." And Eloise stood, walked to her, hugged her and whispered, "Then do it, baby, but don't you let that badge change who you are." And in that moment generations connected, hope ignited, and something powerful was passed forward. A kind of armor no academy could issue. As months passed, other cities began proposing their own versions of Eloise's law, and national leaders invited Jalen to testify before Congress on police accountability. His testimony was short, direct, and unforgettable. He held up a photo of his grandmother, paused, and said, "This is who the system forgot, and this is who we're fighting for." No charts, no stats, just truth, and it echoed through the chamber like thunder after the hearing. Multiple federal officials approached him about national reform, but he told them, "Don't invite me if you're not ready to be uncomfortable." Back in the city, the police department underwent internal restructuring, new leadership installed, new oversight boards formed, and every cadet now required to complete 60 hours of community immersion with elders before receiving a badge. A change driven by public demand, not political favor, and though many skeptics called it symbolic, others saw the effect immediately. Trust didn't return overnight, but the fear began to lift. And that mattered more than press releases. Eloise celebrated her 73rd birthday under the mural they painted of her on the community center wall, surrounded by children singing, neighbors cheering, and Jalen holding back tears as he handed her a small gift. Inside was a gold bracelet engraved with the date. She stood back up from the pavement and changed everything. "Because you didn't stay down," he said, and she smiled. "You don't survive this long by staying down." And the crowd roared days later. The documentary team finished their film, titled 72 and Still Standing, chronicling her story from the moment she left the store that morning to the day the law was signed. It premiered at the local theater, tickets free, and the line wrapped around the block. Inside there were no celebrities, no red carpets, just community, just people who knew her not from screens but from the sidewalk, from the porch, from the church pew. And when the lights dimmed and the footage began, the room fell into silence. The slap played on screen. Then the aftermath, the struggle, the courtroom, the change, and finally Eloise's face smiling in front of the legal center, strong, radiant, unbroken. And when the credits rolled, no one clapped at first. Not because they weren't moved, but because they were so moved they couldn't speak. Then slowly, hands came together, and then rose, and the ovation thundered through the room like waves of gratitude too big for words afterward. A reporter asked Eloise what she would tell her younger self. If she could, she thought for a moment, then said, "I'd tell her she was never invisible, even when they acted like she was." And that quote went viral the next morning, printed on shirts, pinned on lockers, posted in classrooms, even read aloud at a high school graduation by a student who never met her, but said her story taught him to stand up, even when your legs shake. In time, Eloise's name was added to the local school district's curriculum, taught alongside other civil rights figures. Her story now required reading in 8th grade history, and one by one, students began to realize that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they carry grocery bags and walk with a cane. And sometimes justice doesn't come from the top down but from the ground up, sparked by a single voice refusing to be silenced. Officer Ryan Kelman was released on parole after serving 17 months, relocated to another state, and faded from public view. His story now a cautionary tale, studied in training rooms, as a symbol of what happens when power forgets empathy. But Eloise Daniels, she remained a fixture of her neighborhood, not just for what happened to her but for what she made of it. She taught workshops, told stories, passed on lessons, and every time someone asked if she was angry, she'd laugh gently and say, "I was hurt, not broken, and now I'm busy." Because her life had become more than a story, it was a movement. And that movement lived on not in courtrooms or laws alone but in every person who walked taller because she refused to fall quietly. So if you're watching this now, if you followed her journey from beginning to end, don't let it stop here. Share this story, talk about it, act on it, because somewhere in your city, someone else is walking home, carrying oranges, crossing the street, just trying to make it through the day. And whether they make it with peace or pain may depend on whether you speak up, whether you watch quietly, or whether you stand like Eloise did, and remind the world that no one is invisible, that dignity has no expiration date, and that justice, when demanded together, always finds a way to rise.